Day 935 of the Ukrainian War Map, also known as the Russo-Ukrainian War. Juzzie here, and today is another update as I take a simplified and down-to-earth approach to some of the most important happenings on the ground in Ukraine. So starting off, we'll take a look at those Russian losses, as currently Russia sits on more than 633,000 military personnel losses, representing an additional 1,170 in the past day. Then as for hardware losses, 6 tanks, 20 APVs, and 23 artillery, plus 1 air defense system. Then, with a lot of activity ongoing in the Kursk region, and where the information landscape gets a bit muddy, with Ukrainian counteroffensives on top of Russian counteroffensives on top of a Ukrainian counter-invasion. So, switching to the appropriate map, and it's possible the AFU's Corn unit puts it best when speaking about the cauldron, that is the Glashkovsky district, as they state that now begins a new operation where Russia has only 2 choices: leave the territory or stay and get into encirclement. And they even doubled down in saying that the choice for Russia is shame or death, with their somewhat confident expectation that 8,000 Russian troops could be put into a very risky scenario in this region, all just below the Sime River. So starting off and zooming in on the map, as battles are intensifying in Veseloy, in combination with Ukrainian forces applying pressure on Russian positions on multiple fronts now. And the situation appears serious now, with Russian counteroffensive efforts in Korenovo facing difficulties and were set to get bogged down. Russian sources also reported deteriorating conditions for their side on the part of the wider Glovo District, where of course we see Ukrainian forces have successfully crossed the border and are solidifying their positions. And to think, all of this happened in response to a Russian counterattack, with a number of rumors going around in the past few days now suggesting that Ukraine actually wanted the Russian forces to come in attack formations closer to the front lines and far beyond their more stable river positions, all as a means for the AFU to lull them into a false sense of security, then take them to the cleaners. And although it's difficult to verify the authenticity of those claims, the general situation on the ground is unusually different, where one offensive is met with another offensive, leading to the Russian forces dealing with some serious encirclement concerns. Take, for example, one such Russian Z blogger writing about the increasingly difficult situation of the Russian armed forces in the settlement of Gloshkovo, as he expressed regret, stating that while it was already evident in the morning that the situation in the south was challenging and the enemy had achieved success, referring to Ukraine of course, some of his colleagues in fact downplayed it. In fact, this was quite common across the board, and that is to say across the map a lot of the time. And isn't it funny how the acceptance of the harsh realities on the ground could lead the Russian army to not put themselves in these types of positions, as you can see on the map, in the first place, as they would instead coordinate the operations as required, but instead their information space is so distorted that they could continue to say that everything is under control and going according to plan, while they continue to experience some really meaningful setbacks on the battlefield itself. And perhaps a perfect example of this is, take for example, Russian sources posted footage of what they called Ukrainian tank cemetery in Kursk. And yet, some of these tanks have Russian tactical markings on them from 2022, markings of which we haven't actually seen since 2022 either. Though something we did see in Kursk due to the ongoing activities is the capture of the Russian T-72 B3M, so the 2022 upgrade model, taken by the AFU somewhere in this embattled zone. Then also, somewhere in the Kursk, and something that happened a few days ago, but it is worthy of a mention, is how we saw a Ukrainian engineering vehicle clear a passageway for infantry, clearing the Russian Dragon's Teeth on the border with the Kursk region. As you can see, these cope cones don't require a lot of effort to move, especially given how relatively small they are and they sit on top of the earth. Then headed down on the map to the Donetsk region, as Ukrainian President Zelensky stated, quote, "We hold our positions no matter how difficult it is. We put pressure on Russia and do everything to make the war felt where it was brought to Ukraine." all of which seems to somewhat correspond with the existence, or the still existing garrison in the west of Novelska, that the AFU still holds parts of, at least so far. But also specifically around here, we can see the Russian difficulties in heading south from Ukrainsk, which has led them to push more westerly, also suggesting that, at least so far, Ukraine is focusing artillery and other means to either slow down or stop Russian advancements to capture this very encircled location on the map. Also, when headed to the Pokrovsk direction, the first bit of rain started over the weekend, with just a little more expected later this week, which precisely means it's a race against the clock for Russia to advance as far as they can before the muddy season arrives in as little as 3 to 5 weeks. Offensive operations become pretty difficult after that point. Then taking a look around the map, because somewhere in the east we saw a destroyed Russian 220mm MLRS BM-21 Urigan Grad platform, which was looking a bit toasty after its demise. Then also in the east, we saw the event of a Russian MTLB on fire in the Donetsk region. Then we saw the destruction of a Russian Mr. S self-propelled howitzer that was hiding in the tree line, attempting to hide in the tree line, but it didn't work out for them. Then headed way north on the map into Russia as drones were spotted over Russia's Murmansk region again yesterday, which would mark the second or third time that this has happened in the past 4 or 5 days. Now, the second time, from about 3 days ago now, turned out to not actually be Ukrainian drones, but instead were small Russian planes, where Russian air defenses mistook them for Ukrainian drones and fired at them. And no good came from that event that happened. And yet, if Russia were to call this conflict for what it really is, namely a war, then friendly fire incidents like those ones would become avoidable due to the stricter use of airspace. Then headed to some news, as for the most recent escalation threats where it relates to the use of Western weapons on Russian soil, targets within Russia. As in response to Putin's threats, the foreign ministers of Sweden and Finland confirmed that Ukraine has authorization from both of these countries to use their weapons on Russian territory. Around the same time, Washington stated that it didn't accept the idea of Storm Shadow missiles used on Russian military targets inside of Russia as being something that would be tantamount to NATO starting a war with Moscow, which was a comment specifically in response to Putin at the end of the week, who stated that the usage of such weapons would mean that NATO is directly involved. But all of this raises a really great point. So this is one of Russia's greatest weapons right here. It's the classic escalation narrative that can indeed affect the inflow or speed of inflow of weapons from Ukraine's Western partners. Interestingly, for this Putin interview, he decided to play down the effects of Ukrainian-produced UAVs flying deep into Russian airspace. So we see this tacit acceptance because that ship has already sailed, and there's nothing that the Kremlin can really do about it. Then with a pretty busy couple of days in the economic space for Russia. As starting off, take for example, China has prohibited its automakers from establishing new factories within Russia. This decision reflects China's caution in deepening its economic involvement in Russia amid international scrutiny and the ongoing geopolitical tensions resulting from the Russo-Ukrainian war. Or simply put, Russia is a risky market these days. Then in some more economic related news, and bear with me on this one, so a man in Moscow freaked out after getting trapped in an elevator. He damaged the cabin out of rage for the event, with the other 2 elevators in this 23-story apartment already out of service due to a lack of spare parts. So there's going to be a lot of people using stairs in Russia in the future, due to the fact that sanctions are taking their effect on this industry, as Russia, like most countries, isn't willing to entrust their lives to their own elevator manufacturing, which is usually non-existent, because it's the safety and the precision engineering of, for example, the German and the US manufacturers that most people will only trust when they're stuck in a metal encasing 10 to 100 floors above the ground. Then lastly, for some economy news, and as was expected, the Russian central bank officially raised its interest rate to 19%. And I always have a lot to say about this, but for today, I'll just say it's a rate increase that's quite inconsistent with the figures Russia officially publishes on its inflation rate, really a corresponding figure right there, which they say is currently at 9.0%. And though the actual figure is multiples higher than this official figure, as per many analysts' expectations, even if it was just 9%, then it's been sustained at this level, give or take, for the last couple of years, which is no good for any economy, truly. Then to some more news, and an emotional scene unfolded over the weekend as 103 Ukrainian defenders released from Russian captivity, who were then reunited with their loved ones, some after more than 2 years imprisonment. Then with an unusually different video today, I'll round it off with a few funnies. Most unusual funnies. Now the first one could just as easily be a Russian hardware update, as we see here the Russian mobile mortar. So this one is the 2B11 120mm mortar, attached to a motorized cart. And when watching the full video, you can tell how the Russian battlefield engineers are very proud of this contraption, the way they just talk about it. Though with a maximum range of 7,100 meters for the mortar, not the golf buggy, FPV drones are going to have a field day with this setup. Plus, fair to say, the chassis and the wheels themselves are not exactly built for an all-purpose, all-terrain environment, but most importantly, this type of setup is going to miss out on the optimal accuracy as found from a traditional ground setup, which is much better suited for fine aiming adjustments. Then to another unusual funny, and this one's more like a modern day suspense thriller or horror film, as the Russian media outlet RT News posted this footage for some reason of a Ukrainian drone hunting a Russian soldier. So what we saw here was one soldier yelling out to the other saying, "Turn on the electronic warfare system." And so it is quite terrifying how they peek around the corner to see the drone effectively lying in wait for them. Not to mention, these sorts of situations put them completely in a defensive stance as well. Then to a final quick funny, so the Kremlin recently overstated the number of warships in its Ocean 2024 Arctic naval drills. While the Kremlin announced over 400 vessels, later accounts showed it was almost 150 less than what was announced, as many Russian naval vessels have fallen into disrepair and are considered, quote, functionally inactive. But on these Kremlin claims, can you really blame a Putin for trying? Shrinkage can happen. Always talking the big talk. So that's it for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Nowhere near as in-depth as I had wanted the video to be today. So yeah, but hey, thanks again for watching, subscribing, liking, the support. Thanks so much, and I do hope to see all of you guys there in the next one. Cheers!